My name is Cassandra Miller, and at 26 years old, I'm standing in my childhood bedroom for the last time, packing what little belongs to me. The house that raised me now feels like a stranger's home because my father just announced that my younger sister Ashley will inherit everything: the family business, this house, even my mother's jewelry. I get nothing. As I close the door behind me, I leave a sealed envelope on Dad's desk containing a secret that will destroy Ashley's perfect world forever. What happens next will make her scream those exact words. Before we dive into this story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that like button if family drama stories speak to you. Subscribe for more shocking family betrayals that'll keep you on the edge of your seat. Trust me, you won't believe what Ashley was really hiding from our family all these years. Growing up in the Miller household meant living in Ashley's shadow from the moment our mother died when I was 12 and she was 9. Our father, Robert Miller, owned a successful construction company that had been in our family for 3 generations, and from early on, it was clear who his favorite was. While I scrambled to take care of a grieving 9-year-old and manage household duties, Ashley charmed her way into Dad's heart with her bright smile and natural charisma. She had this way of tilting her head and batting her eyelashes that made grown men melt, especially our father. The pattern started small but grew more obvious each year. When I brought home straight A's, Dad would nod approvingly but save his real enthusiasm for Ashley's B+ effort, calling her his little genius and taking her out for ice cream. When I learned to drive and got my license without a single error on the test, Dad barely looked up from his newspaper. But when Ashley simply expressed interest in learning to drive 2 years later, he spent 3 weeks teaching her personally and bought her a brand new Honda Civic for her 16th birthday. I drove our mother's old station wagon until the transmission gave out. The construction business became another battleground for his affections. I started working there part-time at 15, learning every aspect from bookkeeping to client relations. I could read blueprints, manage schedules, and handle difficult customers with ease. Ashley showed up occasionally during summers, mostly to flirt with the construction workers and complain about getting her nails dirty. Yet somehow, Dad saw her brief appearances as dedication while treating my years of hard work as expected duty. He'd bragged to his friends about how Ashley had natural business instincts based on a single suggestion she'd made about office organization. The favoritism reached its peak last month when Ashley graduated from college with a communications degree and immediately convinced Dad that I was stealing from the company. She presented him with forged documents, fake receipts, and altered bank statements that painted me as an embezzling thief who'd been siphoning money for months. The evidence was sophisticated, too sophisticated for someone without inside knowledge of our accounting system. She'd planted fake invoices in my desk drawer, created false paper trails linking me to suspicious transactions, and even arranged for cash to be discovered in my car during a surprise inspection she'd orchestrated. What made the betrayal cut deeper was how eagerly Dad believed every word. There was no investigation, no benefit of the doubt, no consideration of my years of loyalty. Ashley presented her case with tears streaming down her face, playing the heartbroken sister who'd discovered her sibling's terrible secret. She spoke about feeling conflicted between family loyalty and doing the right thing, about sleepless nights wrestling with whether to expose me. Her performance was flawless, complete with trembling voice and devastating disappointment. Dad ate it up completely. When he confronted me in my office, his face was cold with disappointment and anger. 26 years of being his daughter, 14 years of stepping up after Mom died, 8 years of working in his business, none of it mattered against Ashley's tears and fabricated evidence. He told me I was lucky he wasn't pressing charges, that Ashley had begged him to show mercy. The final insult came when he announced that Ashley would inherit everything because she'd proven her loyalty and honesty, while I'd shown my true character through theft and betrayal. Standing there watching my father choose my manipulative sister over me was the moment I realized I'd been fighting a losing battle my entire life. Ashley's campaign against me had been months in the making, a masterpiece of manipulation that revealed a calculating mind I'd never suspected existed beneath her bubbly exterior. She'd spent weeks laying groundwork, creating a web of lies so intricate that even I had to admire its twisted brilliance. The fake invoices were dated going back 6 months, each one slightly different to avoid looking like a pattern, each amount carefully chosen to seem believable but not so large as to raise immediate red flags. She'd studied our vendor relationships, learned their billing cycles, and created documents that perfectly mimicked their formatting and language. The altered bank statements were equally impressive in their deception. Ashley had somehow gained access to my personal banking information and created modified statements showing large cash deposits that coincided with the supposed thefts. She'd even gone so far as to open a savings account in my name at a different bank, forging my signature and using my social security number, then making deposits that matched the missing money from the company accounts. When Dad's accountant investigated, the paper trail seemed ironclad. But Ashley's real genius lay in manipulating the human element. She'd spent months building relationships with key office employees, particularly Linda from accounting and Marcus from purchasing. Both had been struggling financially, and Ashley had quietly helped them with small loans and gifts, creating a sense of obligation. When the time came to corroborate her story, they reluctantly provided statements supporting her version of events. Linda claimed she'd noticed discrepancies in the books but hadn't wanted to believe ill of me. Marcus swore he'd seen me working late on nights when suspicious transactions occurred. The confrontation itself was theater worthy of Broadway. Ashley had timed it perfectly for a Friday afternoon when Dad was stressed about a major project deadline and several key employees were present to witness the drama. She burst into his office with tears already flowing, clutching a manila folder filled with her fabricated evidence. Her voice shook as she explained how she'd discovered irregularities while helping organize files, how she'd desperately hoped she was wrong, how she'd spent sleepless nights deciding whether to come forward against her own sister. When Dad stormed into my office 20 minutes later, his face was a mask of disappointment and rage I'd never seen directed at me before. He threw the folder on my desk, papers scattering across the surface, and demanded an explanation for what he called my betrayal of everything our family stands for. The evidence was overwhelming and damning, each piece building on the others to create an unshakable case. Bank records, vendor complaints, employee testimonies, security footage timestamps. Ashley had thought of everything. My attempts to defend myself only made things worse. Every explanation sounded weak against the mountain of evidence. When I pointed out inconsistencies, Dad accused me of trying to lie my way out of trouble. When I suggested someone else might be responsible, he demanded to know who I was trying to blame for my own crimes. Ashley stood behind him throughout the confrontation, her face a perfect mask of pained disappointment, occasionally dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. She even reached out to touch my arm at one point, whispering how sorry she was that things had come to this. The most devastating moment came when Ashley suggested I might need professional help for what she called my problems. She spoke about how stress could make people do things they never thought possible, how financial pressure could drive good people to bad choices. She offered to help me find a therapist, to support me through rehabilitation, to stand by me despite what I'd done. Her generosity in the face of my supposed betrayal only made Dad more convinced of her nobility and my guilt. By the time the confrontation ended, I wasn't just facing accusations of theft, I was being painted as someone with serious psychological issues who needed intervention. The aftermath was swift and brutal. Word spread through our small office within hours, then through our tight-knit community by the end of the week. Extended family members called to express their disappointment and concern. Former friends began avoiding me at the grocery store, their expressions mixing pity with disgust. Ashley had successfully transformed me from respected family member to community pariah with a few well-placed lies and forged documents. The woman I'd helped raise, protected, and sacrificed for had destroyed my reputation with surgical precision. As I sat in my car outside the house that night, the weight of forgotten sacrifices crashed over me like a tide of bitter memories. After Mom died, I'd transformed overnight from a carefree 12-year-old into a surrogate mother for Ashley, giving up pieces of my childhood that I could never reclaim. While other kids my age were discovering themselves through sports, friendships, and typical teenage rebellion, I was packing school lunches, helping with homework, and making sure a traumatized 9-year-old felt safe and loved in a world that had suddenly become unpredictable. The academic sacrifices were the first to pile up. I'd been accepted into the advanced placement program at school, with teachers encouraging me to pursue early admission to university. Instead, I dropped those classes to maintain a schedule that allowed me to be home when Ashley got out of school. I quit the debate team, stopped taking piano lessons, and turned down the editor position on the school newspaper because Ashley needed help with her math homework and someone to listen to her fears about Dad disappearing like Mom had. My grades remained solid, but my dreams of academic excellence faded into background noise behind the immediate needs of family survival. The financial sacrifices came later but cut deeper. At 15, I started working part-time at a local diner, lying about my availability to ensure I could still help Ashley with her increasingly demanding schedule of dance lessons, cheerleading practice, and social activities. Every dollar I earned went toward Ashley's needs: new dance shoes when hers wore out, cheerleading uniforms, birthday party gifts for her friends, gas money for rides to events when Dad was working late. I wore hand-me-downs from cousins while Ashley got new outfits for every school dance. College was supposed to be my escape, my chance to finally focus on my own dreams and ambitions. I'd earned a partial scholarship to the state university and had been accepted into their business program with plans to eventually take over Dad's company through merit rather than nepotism. But Ashley's senior year of high school coincided with my freshman year of college, and she struggled with anxiety about change, fear of being alone, and uncertainty about her future. Dad suggested I defer admission for a year to help her transition. 1 year became 2, then 3, until finally the scholarship expired and my acceptance was withdrawn. Working at Dad's construction company became my consolation prize, though I threw myself into it with the dedication I'd once reserved for academics. I learned every aspect of the business from ground up, literally. I spent mornings in the office managing schedules and client communications, afternoons on job sites understanding the actual construction process, and evenings studying building codes and industry regulations. Within 2 years, I'd streamlined our billing system, expanded our client base by 30%, and implemented safety protocols that reduced our insurance costs significantly. Meanwhile, Ashley coasted through high school with minimal effort, secure in the knowledge that I'd handle any crisis that arose. When she failed chemistry her junior year, I hired a tutor and worked with her every night until she passed the makeup exam. When she got arrested for underage drinking at a party, I negotiated with the lawyer and sat through community service hours with her. When she totaled her car during a joyride with friends, I convinced Dad it was an accident and used my savings to cover the insurance deductible. The personal sacrifices were perhaps the cruelest. My boyfriend Jake had been patient for years with my family obligations, understanding when I canceled dates to attend Ashley's events or missed romantic weekends to help her through various crises. But as we approached our mid-20s, his patience wore thin. He wanted a partner who could prioritize our relationship, not a woman who dropped everything whenever her sister called. The breakup was inevitable but devastating, especially when he told me I'd spent so many years taking care of Ashley that I'd forgotten how to live my own life. Even my health suffered under the constant stress of managing everyone else's needs while neglecting my own. I developed chronic headaches, digestive issues, and insomnia that doctors attributed to stress and overwork. I ignored the symptoms, pushing through fatigue and pain because there was always another crisis to handle, another problem to solve, another sacrifice to make for family harmony. Ashley, meanwhile, thrived under all the support and attention, never questioning why her sister looked increasingly exhausted and withdrawn. The final insult came when Ashley graduated from college and immediately began criticizing my contributions to the family. During family dinners, she'd make comments about how I never did enough or how I should be more supportive of her career aspirations. She complained that I was too focused on work and not invested enough in family relationships. The irony was staggering. The woman whose entire life I'd subsidized and supported was lecturing me about family loyalty. But Dad nodded along with her assessments, apparently having forgotten every sacrifice I'd made to keep our family functioning after Mom's death. Sitting in that car, I realized that 14 years of devoted sacrifice had been erased by a few weeks of Ashley's lies. Every late night, every missed opportunity, every dollar spent and dream deferred meant nothing when weighed against her performance as the innocent victim of my supposed betrayal. The woman I'd helped raise had systematically destroyed the life I'd built while caring for her, and our father had chosen to believe her version of reality over everything he'd witnessed firsthand for more than a decade. What my father didn't know, and what Ashley certainly never suspected, was that I'd been conducting my own investigation for months before her accusations surfaced. The first red flag had appeared 6 months earlier when I noticed small discrepancies in our company's petty cash account, nothing dramatic, just $20 or $30 missing here and there. At first, I'd assumed it was honest mistakes or forgotten receipts, but the pattern was too consistent to be accidental. When I mentioned it to Ashley during a casual conversation, her reaction was unusually defensive, immediately suggesting that maybe Linda from accounting was being careless with records. My suspicions deepened when I started noticing Ashley's behavior changes over the past year. The sister I'd raised was naturally charming but had always been somewhat irresponsible with money, frequently asking Dad for advances on her allowance or small loans for unexpected expenses. Suddenly, she was paying for expensive dinners, buying designer clothes, and taking weekend trips to nearby casinos without any obvious source of funding. When I asked about her newfound financial freedom, she claimed she'd gotten lucky with some investments and part-time consulting work, but could never provide specifics when pressed. The breaking point came when I discovered Ashley using my computer late one night, claiming hers had crashed and she needed to finish an important project. She seemed nervous when I walked into the office, quickly closing windows and stammering explanations about email problems. The next morning, I checked the computer's browsing history and found visits to online gambling sites, cryptocurrency exchanges, and loan application websites. More disturbing were the attempts to access our company's banking system using my login credentials, attempts that had been successful. That's when I decided to hire Marcus Rodriguez, a private investigator recommended by one of Dad's lawyer friends. Marcus was a former police detective with expertise in financial fraud and white-collar crime. I told him I suspected employee theft at our company but didn't mention Ashley specifically, wanting his investigation to follow evidence rather than assumptions. What he uncovered over the following 2 months was far worse than simple embezzlement. It was a web of addiction, debt, and desperation that painted my sister as someone I'd never truly known. The gambling addiction was the foundation of everything else. Ashley had been frequenting Crown Casino every weekend for over a year, initially winning small amounts that fed her confidence and encouraged bigger bets. Like most gambling addicts, she'd experienced early success that convinced her she had a system, a natural ability to read the odds. But gambling houses don't stay in business by letting people win consistently. Within 6 months, Ashley was losing far more than she won, chasing bigger jackpots to recover her losses, borrowing money to fund increasingly desperate bets. When legal credit sources were exhausted, Ashley had turned to dangerous alternatives. Marcus provided photos of her meeting with known loan sharks in parking lots and seedy bars, accepting cash in exchange for promissory notes at astronomical interest rates. These weren't the kind of people who accepted excuses or payment plans, they were criminals who used violence to collect debts. The amounts were staggering. Ashley owed over $60,000 to various lenders, with weekly interest payments that exceeded her monthly income. The prescription pill dealing was Ashley's attempt to generate quick cash for gambling and debt payments. She'd convinced 3 different doctors that she suffered from chronic pain, anxiety, and attention deficit disorder, obtaining prescriptions for OxyContin, Xanax, and Adderall that she sold to college students and young professionals. Marcus had video evidence of her conducting transactions in nightclub bathrooms and coffee shop parking lots, charging premium prices for pills that cost her almost nothing through insurance coverage. Perhaps most shocking was Ashley's secret relationship with David Chen, a married man 15 years her senior who worked as a regional manager for a competing construction company. David was funding much of Ashley's lifestyle, giving her cash gifts and paying for expensive dinners and hotel rooms in exchange for information about Dad's business operations and upcoming bid proposals. Ashley was essentially conducting industrial espionage against our family company, selling our competitive advantages to help her lover's employer underbid our contracts. The evidence Marcus gathered was comprehensive and damning. Bank records showed regular cash deposits that corresponded with her drug sales and meetings with David. Security camera footage from various locations documented her gambling, drug dealing, and romantic encounters. Phone records revealed hundreds of calls to known bookies, loan sharks, and David's personal number. Most incriminating were audio recordings Marcus had obtained through legal surveillance techniques, capturing Ashley discussing her schemes and expressing contempt for our father's trust in her. The final piece of evidence was perhaps the most personally hurtful. Ashley had been using my computer and login credentials to steal money from our company for months, carefully timing her thefts to coincide with my legitimate work sessions to avoid suspicion. She'd created false vendor accounts, submitted fake invoices, and redirected payments to accounts she controlled. The sophistication of her operation revealed months of planning and a deep understanding of our business systems that she'd gained by pretending to show interest in helping with office work. When Marcus presented his full report, complete with photographs, bank records, and timeline documentation, I finally understood the scope of Ashley's betrayal. She hadn't just stolen money, she'd systematically exploited every relationship and advantage our family had provided. The sister I'd protected and sacrificed for had been living a double life that put our entire family at risk from dangerous criminals and business competitors. The most painful realization was that while I'd been worrying about her well-being and future, she'd been planning to destroy my reputation and steal my inheritance to fund her destructive lifestyle. Despite having overwhelming evidence of Ashley's crimes, I made the decision to protect her one final time. The information could have sent her to prison and exposed our family to public humiliation. Instead, I chose to leave quietly, taking the evidence with me as insurance but hoping that my departure would be enough to satisfy whatever conscience Ashley might still possess. It was a decision motivated by love for the little girl I'd helped raise, even though that little girl had grown into someone I no longer recognized. The family meeting that would seal my fate was scheduled for a Sunday afternoon in early November, with autumn leaves falling outside the windows of our family home like tears from heaven. Dad had called everyone Uncle Thomas and Aunt Margaret, Cousin Jennifer and her husband Mike, even elderly Grandpa Miller from the assisted living facility. The dining room table was extended to its full length, covered with Mom's good china that only came out for significant occasions. Ashley had spent the morning playing hostess, preparing coffee and arranging store-bought pastries to create the illusion of domestic competence. Dad stood at the head of the table with the solemnity of a judge pronouncing sentence. He'd prepared a speech about family values, business integrity, and the painful necessity of making difficult decisions based on character rather than blood relations. His voice carried the weight of disappointment and moral authority as he explained how recent discoveries had forced him to reevaluate everything he thought he knew about his daughters. Ashley sat to his right, her face a masterpiece of composed sorrow, occasionally dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief that had belonged to our mother. The performance began with Ashley's reluctant testimony about discovering my supposed crimes. She spoke in a voice barely above a whisper, explaining how she'd noticed irregularities in the company books during her recent efforts to help with office organization. Her hands trembled as she described the sleepless nights spent wrestling with her conscience, torn between loyalty to her sister and responsibility to the family business. She painted herself as the reluctant whistleblower who'd been forced into an impossible position by my betrayal of their trust. Uncle Thomas, who'd always been Dad's closest confidant, asked probing questions about the evidence. Ashley answered with perfect precision, citing specific dates, dollar amounts, and documentation that supported her accusations. She'd prepared meticulously for this interrogation, anticipating every possible question and crafting responses that painted me as increasingly desperate and reckless. When Aunt Margaret expressed disbelief that I could steal from family, Ashley's voice broke as she admitted she'd felt the same shock and denial before accepting the painful truth. The reading of the revised will felt like attending my own funeral while still breathing. Dad explained that he'd consulted with lawyers and decided to leave everything to Ashley, who'd proven her loyalty and moral character through her difficult decision to expose wrongdoing. The family business, built over 3 generations, would pass to her along with the house, investments, and even Mom's jewelry that I'd expected to inherit. I would receive nothing except the suggestion that I seek professional help for my issues and perhaps someday earn forgiveness through rehabilitation and restitution. Extended family members took turns expressing their disappointment and concern. Cousin Jennifer, who'd borrowed money from me twice for her children's medical expenses, spoke about feeling betrayed by someone she'd trusted. Grandpa Miller, whose memory was increasingly unreliable but whose moral certainty remained strong, declared that he'd never imagined a Miller could bring such shame to the family name. Each condemnation felt like another nail in the coffin of my identity as a valued family member. Ashley's response to each criticism was perfectly calibrated to increase sympathy for her position while deepening condemnation of mine. She spoke about her hopes that I would accept responsibility and begin the healing process. She offered to help pay for therapy and addiction treatment, suggesting that gambling or drug problems might explain my behavior. Her generosity in the face of betrayal made her appear even more noble while implying I suffered from serious psychological disorders that required intervention. The cruelest moment came during a brief recess when Ashley cornered me in the kitchen while others used the bathroom or stretched their legs. Her mask of sorrowful concern disappeared instantly, replaced by a cold smile of triumph that revealed the calculating predator beneath her innocent facade. She told me how easy it had been to convince everyone of my guilt, how she'd spent months laying groundwork by making subtle comments about my stress levels and financial concerns. She described watching me work late nights and weekends, knowing she was stealing money that would eventually be blamed on my legitimate access to company accounts. Ashley's confession in that kitchen was delivered with the casual cruelty of someone revealing a particularly clever practical joke. She explained how she'd studied our banking systems, learned my login patterns, and timed her thefts to coincide with my work sessions. She'd created false vendor relationships and submitted fake invoices with the same attention to detail I'd always applied to legitimate business operations. The forgery skills she'd developed copying my signature for the false evidence had been practiced for months as she endorsed checks stolen from company accounts. The final insult was her warning about my future behavior. Ashley made it clear that any attempt to challenge her story or present alternative theories would be met with escalated accusations. She had backup plans ready, additional forged evidence, false witnesses prepared to testify about my erratic behavior, and suggestions that my desperation might lead to violence against family members. She'd thought of everything, including how to destroy any credibility I might retain if I chose to fight back against her accusations. When we returned to the dining room, Ashley resumed her performance as the heartbroken sister hoping for my redemption. She spoke about wanting our relationship to heal someday, about her willingness to forgive and forget if I accepted responsibility and made proper amends. Dad nodded approvingly at her compassion, while extended family members marveled at her strength in the face of such personal betrayal. I realized that nothing I could say or do would change their minds. Ashley had won completely. The meeting concluded with Dad's emotional appeal for me to accept the situation and begin making better choices. He offered to help arrange therapy and suggested that admitting my problems was the first step toward recovery. The family's disappointment was palpable, but so was their hope that love and support might eventually redeem me from whatever darkness had led to my downfall. As they began discussing Ashley's bright future and her plans for expanding the business, I quietly excused myself and went upstairs to pack the few personal belongings I could call my own. That night, sitting on my childhood bed surrounded by boxes and memories, I made the decision that would change everything. The envelope I placed on Dad's desk contained not just evidence of Ashley's crimes, but proof of a deception so comprehensive that it would shatter the foundation of her perfect world. I was done protecting someone who'd used my love against me, done sacrificing my future for someone who saw my kindness as weakness to be exploited. Ashley wanted to play games with our family's future, but she'd forgotten that I'd been watching and learning from her manipulation tactics for months. The November rain drummed against my bedroom windows as I folded the last of my clothes into cardboard boxes I'd gotten from the local liquor store. Everything I was taking could fit into my car: a few photo albums, my laptop, some books, and the clothes I'd bought with my own money over the years. I left behind the jewelry Dad had given me for birthdays and graduations, the furniture he'd bought for my room, even the graduation diploma hanging on the wall. Those things belonged to his daughter, and I was no longer sure that person existed in his mind. The hardest decision was what to do with the evidence Marcus Rodriguez had gathered. Part of me wanted to march downstairs and confront Ashley with photographs of her dealing drugs and meeting loan sharks, to force Dad to see the truth about his precious golden child. But I knew that approach would backfire. Ashley had spent months conditioning everyone to see me as unstable and desperate, so any evidence I presented would be dismissed as fabricated revenge. Instead, I chose a more strategic approach that would let the truth speak for itself without my contaminated delivery. I spent hours crafting the letter that would accompany Marcus's investigation file. The tone had to be perfect, not angry or accusatory, but factual and concerned. I wrote about hiring the private investigator because of discrepancies I'd noticed in company accounts, emphasizing my concern for protecting the business rather than defending myself. I explained that the investigation had uncovered activities far more serious than simple embezzlement, activities that put our entire family at risk from dangerous criminals and federal prosecution. The evidence package itself was organized with the same meticulous attention to detail I'd learned from years of managing Dad's business affairs. Bank records showing Ashley's cash deposits were cross-referenced with dates and times of her gambling activities, drug transactions, and meetings with loan sharks. Photographs were arranged chronologically to tell a clear story of escalating criminal behavior. Video footage was indexed with timestamps and location notes. Phone records highlighted patterns of communication with known criminals and competitors. The section documenting Ashley's relationship with David Chen was particularly damning. Marcus had obtained hotel receipts showing regular rooms paid for by David's corporate credit card, restaurant charges for expensive dinners that coincided with Ashley's presence in locations near David's business meetings, and most importantly, evidence that confidential information about Dad's upcoming bids had been shared with competing contractors. The industrial espionage charges alone could result in federal prosecution and massive civil liability. But the most personally devastating evidence was the audio recordings Marcus had captured during his surveillance. Ashley's voice, clear and unmistakable, discussing her contempt for our father's trust and her plans to manipulate the inheritance situation to her advantage. In one particularly chilling conversation with David, she laughed about how easy it was to convince Dad of my guilt, describing me as too stupid and naive to realize I was being set up. Her casual cruelty towards someone who'd sacrificed everything for her welfare revealed the true nature of the woman she'd become. The timeline I constructed showed Ashley's criminal activities beginning shortly after she graduated from college, accelerating rapidly as her gambling losses mounted and debt payments became unmanageable. The progression from occasional casino visits to regular meetings with loan sharks spanned less than 18 months, demonstrating how quickly her situation had spiraled out of control. The amounts involved were staggering: over $80,000 in total debts and theft, with weekly interest payments that guaranteed her problems would only worsen. My personal letter to Dad was the most difficult thing I'd ever written. I tried to explain why I hadn't come forward earlier, emphasizing my hope that Ashley would recognize her problems and seek help before involving the family. I described the pain of watching someone I'd raised like my own daughter systematically betray everyone who'd ever loved or trusted her. I acknowledged that my decision to investigate secretly rather than report suspicions immediately might seem wrong, but explained that my motivation had been protecting Ashley from consequences I'd hoped could be avoided. The warning section of my letter was stark and urgent. Ashley's debts weren't going to disappear with my departure, and the loan sharks demanding payment weren't going to accept family drama as an excuse for delayed repayment. Dad needed to understand that keeping Ashley's secrets was no longer an option. These were dangerous people who wouldn't hesitate to use violence against family members to pressure their debtors. The federal implications of the industrial espionage meant that prosecution was likely regardless of family wishes if competing contractors decided to file complaints. I included contact information for Marcus Rodriguez and instructions for verifying every piece of evidence in the package. I wanted Dad to understand that this wasn't my word against Ashley's, this was documented proof that could be independently confirmed through official channels. I also provided information about addiction treatment programs and legal defense attorneys who specialized in white-collar crime, hoping that professional intervention might still save Ashley from the worst consequences of her choices. The final paragraph of my letter was my goodbye to the man who'd raised me but had ultimately chosen to believe my accuser over his own daughter. I told him I understood why Ashley's performance had been convincing, acknowledging that she'd learned manipulation skills from watching our family dynamics for years. I expressed hope that someday he might remember the daughter who'd sacrificed her youth to help him raise Ashley, who'd worked unpaid for years to build his business, who'd never asked for anything except recognition and love. As dawn broke over our neighborhood, I sealed the envelope and placed it in the center of Dad's desk where he couldn't miss it. The rain had stopped, and weak November sunlight was filtering through the office windows, illuminating the space where I'd spent countless hours working to build something I'd thought would be mine someday. I took one last look at the family photos covering Dad's desk, pictures of Ashley's graduations, school plays, and achievements, with precious few images of my own milestones. Then I walked out the front door of the only home I'd ever known, leaving behind not just a family but an entire identity that had apparently been built on lies. 3 days after my departure, Dad discovered the envelope while searching his desk for Ashley's college transcripts that she'd requested for a job application. The thick manila package was marked with my handwriting, "For Dad, please read everything before discussing with anyone else. This is urgent." His initial reaction was to set it aside, still angry about my supposed betrayal and reluctant to engage with what he assumed would be desperate attempts at self-justification. But something about the weight of the envelope and the formal presentation made him curious enough to break the seal. The first document was my letter, which Dad later told Uncle Thomas he'd read 3 times before moving on to the supporting evidence. My calm, factual tone was so different from what he'd expected that he found himself paying attention despite his prejudices. When I wrote about hiring a private investigator due to financial discrepancies, his businessman's instincts kicked in. This was exactly the kind of precaution he'd have taken in similar circumstances. The revelation that the investigation had uncovered serious criminal activity rather than simple theft forced him to examine evidence he'd rather ignore. The photographs hit him like physical blows. Ashley meeting with rough-looking men in parking lots, exchanging envelopes in ways that clearly suggested illegal transactions. Ashley in hotel lobbies and restaurants with David Chen, a man Dad recognized as a competitor who'd been underbidding their contracts with suspicious accuracy. Ashley in nightclub bathrooms conducting transactions that could only be drug deals, her bright smile a stark contrast to the sordid nature of her activities. Each image shattered another piece of the innocent daughter he thought he knew. The bank records were even more devastating because Dad understood financial documentation better than anyone. Ashley's cash deposits corresponded perfectly with dates of suspected criminal activities, creating an undeniable pattern of illegal income. The amounts were staggering. Thousands of dollars flowing through accounts Ashley hadn't disclosed to family, money that could only have come from gambling winnings, drug sales, or payment from industrial espionage. The sophistication of her money laundering operation revealed planning and forethought that contradicted her image as an impulsive young woman making poor choices. But the audio recordings were what finally broke through Dad's denial completely. Hearing Ashley's voice casually discussing her manipulation of family relationships, laughing about my naivety, and planning my downfall with calculated cruelty destroyed every assumption he'd made about her character. In one particularly damning conversation, Ashley told David how easy it was to convince their father of my guilt because he wants to believe I'm perfect and she's the problem. The callous way she discussed exploiting Dad's love and trust revealed someone fundamentally different from the daughter he cherished. When Ashley returned from her celebration dinner at the country club, a meal Dad had paid for to congratulate her on inheriting the business, she was slightly intoxicated from expensive wine and basking in triumph. She found him sitting in his study surrounded by scattered documents and photographs, his face pale with shock and rage. Her initial assumption was that he'd discovered additional evidence of my supposed crimes, and she launched into a performance about how sorry she was that I'd disappointed him so deeply. Dad's interruption was quiet but deadly. Explain this. He held up a photograph of Ashley accepting cash from a known loan shark outside a casino, her face clearly visible and unmistakable. Ashley's wine-flushed face went white as she realized the implications. Her first instinct was denial. Claiming the photo was fake, suggesting I'd paid someone to create false evidence, insisting that desperate people would do anything to avoid consequences. But Dad had spent 30 years in construction dealing with contractors who tried to submit false documentation, and he knew authentic evidence when he saw it. The phone call that interrupted their confrontation was perfectly timed to destroy Ashley's remaining credibility. Dad's phone rang while Ashley was still stammering denials, and the voice on the other end was gravelly and threatening. Tell Ashley she's 3 weeks behind on payments, and we're not patient people. If she doesn't have our money by Friday, we'll start collecting from family members. The caller hung up without waiting for a response, leaving Dad staring at his phone in horror while Ashley's face crumpled in defeat. Ashley's breakdown was spectacular and complete. Faced with undeniable evidence and direct threats against her father, she abandoned all pretense and confessed everything. The words poured out in a torrent of desperation, the gambling addiction that had started as harmless fun, the mounting debts that had driven her to desperate measures, the drug dealing that had seemed like easy money, the relationship with David that had provided temporary financial relief in exchange for business secrets. She sobbed as she described the loan sharks who'd been pressuring her for weeks, the threats that had escalated to include violence against family members. The scope of Ashley's deception was breathtaking. She'd been living a double life for over a year, maintaining her innocent facade while conducting criminal activities that put the entire family at risk. The amount of money involved was staggering, over $100,000 in combined debts, theft, and illegal income. Her manipulation of the inheritance situation had been planned for months, not a desperate last-minute attempt to cover her crimes but a calculated strategy to secure resources for ongoing criminal activities. But the most devastating revelation was Ashley's complete lack of remorse for destroying my life. Even as she confessed her crimes, she remained angry that I'd exposed her rather than sorry for the pain she'd caused. Her fury at being caught overshadowed any guilt about the consequences of her actions. When Dad asked how she could frame an innocent person, her own sister who'd sacrificed everything for her welfare, Ashley's response revealed the depth of her narcissism. She was always in the way anyway. This just solved multiple problems at once. Dad's rage when he fully grasped what Ashley had done was unlike anything she'd ever witnessed. The man who'd protected and spoiled her for 23 years looked at her with disgust and betrayal that cut deeper than any physical punishment could have. He'd not only lost one daughter through his own poor judgment, but discovered that the daughter he'd chosen was a criminal sociopath who'd manipulated his love to destroy his family. Ashley's pathetic attempts to justify her actions only made him angrier, each excuse revealing how thoroughly she'd deceived everyone who'd ever cared about her. The sound that erupted from Ashley when she realized the full implications of her exposure wasn't grief or shame, it was rage. She screamed at Dad for being stupid enough to believe the evidence, then screamed at me for being vindictive enough to gather it. But her loudest scream was the phrase that would haunt her forever: "You're joking. This can't be happening." The woman who'd planned and executed my destruction with such precision couldn't believe her own careful schemes had been uncovered and turned against her. The joke, as it turned out, was on her. The morning after Ashley's confession, Dad called the police himself. The evidence package I'd left was too comprehensive to ignore, and the threats from loan sharks made inaction impossible. Detective Sarah Martinez arrived at our house with a team of financial crimes investigators who spent 6 hours cataloging evidence and taking statements. Ashley's attempt to claim everything was my fault collapsed immediately when confronted with timestamps, video evidence, and audio recordings that placed her at crime scenes while I was documentably elsewhere. The legal implications unfolded rapidly and devastatingly. Federal charges for industrial espionage were filed within a week, based on evidence that Ashley had shared confidential bidding information with David Chen's company, causing Dad's business to lose over $200,000 in contracts. The drug-dealing charges carried mandatory minimum sentences that Ashley's expensive lawyer warned could result in 5 to 10 years in federal prison. The theft charges alone exceeded felony thresholds in our state, with enhanced penalties for stealing from family members. But the loan sharks weren't waiting for legal proceedings to collect their money. 2 days after the police investigation began, Dad received a visit from 3 men who made it clear that Ashley's debts hadn't disappeared with her arrest. They wanted their money immediately, with interest compounded daily since Ashley's last payment 6 weeks earlier. The total amount had grown to nearly $90,000, secured by threats against family assets and personnel that left no doubt about their willingness to use violence. The financial destruction extended far beyond Ashley's immediate debts. Dad's construction company faced federal investigation for security breaches that had allowed confidential information to be stolen. Several major clients canceled contracts pending resolution of the criminal case, concerned about working with a company that couldn't protect their competitive information. The business Dad had spent 30 years building was hemorrhaging money and reputation while facing potential civil lawsuits from competitors who'd been underbid using stolen information. Word of Ashley's crimes spread through our small community with the speed and thoroughness of wildfire. The local newspaper ran front-page articles about the Miller family construction scandal, complete with Ashley's arrest photo and details about drug dealing, gambling addiction, and industrial espionage. Former friends and admirers who'd praised Ashley's charm and intelligence now felt foolish for being deceived by her performance. Social media exploded with shocked reactions from people who'd known Ashley since childhood. Extended family members who'd condemned me during that horrible Sunday meeting now called Dad with stammering apologies and requests for my contact information. Cousin Jennifer left tearful voicemails acknowledging how wrong they'd been, admitting they'd been manipulated by Ashley's Oscar-worthy performance. Uncle Thomas drove over personally to confess his shame at believing Ashley's lies without question. Grandpa Miller, despite his declining memory, somehow grasped that he'd sided with the wrong granddaughter and asked repeatedly when I was coming home. Ashley's mental health deteriorated rapidly under the pressure of exposure and consequences. The woman who'd maintained perfect composure while destroying my life fell apart completely when facing the results of her own actions. She was hospitalized twice for panic attacks and once for what doctors suspected was a suicide attempt, though Ashley claimed she'd simply made an error with her medication dosage. Her gambling addiction, no longer funded by theft and drug sales, manifested in desperate behaviors like stealing from purses and shoplifting to get money for slot machines. David Chen's involvement in the scandal destroyed his marriage and career simultaneously. His wife filed for divorce after learning about his affair with Ashley and his role in industrial espionage. His employer fired him immediately and initiated criminal proceedings for corporate espionage. The revelation that he'd been sharing confidential information with a college-aged woman he was sleeping with made him a laughingstock in professional circles where reputation was everything. Dad's attempts to reach me grew increasingly desperate as the full scope of Ashley's betrayal became clear. He hired a private investigator to find my new address, sent letters through my former lawyer, and even contacted my college friends hoping someone would forward his messages. His letters progressed from formal requests for reconciliation to heartbroken pleas for forgiveness, acknowledging the magnitude of his errors and the irreversible damage caused by his choice to believe Ashley over me. The house that had been my childhood home became a monument to shattered illusions and broken trust. Dad wandered through rooms filled with photos and memories of the daughter he thought he knew, unable to reconcile Ashley's crimes with years of believing in her innocence. He removed her pictures from his office but couldn't bring himself to throw them away, storing them in boxes like evidence of his own failure as a father and judge of character. Meanwhile, Ashley's criminal defense strategy involved throwing everyone else under the bus in a final desperate attempt to minimize her own consequences. She claimed David Chen had manipulated her into industrial espionage, suggested that drug dealing had been forced on her by threatening loan sharks, and even tried to argue that gambling addiction was a mental illness that reduced her culpability for theft. When those arguments failed to generate sympathy, she returned to her original strategy of blaming me for her downfall. Ashley's final phone call to me came from county jail 3 weeks after her arrest. Her voice was different. Harder, more desperate, stripped of the sweetness that had fooled so many people for so many years. She alternated between threats and pleading, warning me that she had friends who could make my new life difficult, then begging me to help pay for her legal defense. When I refused to engage with either approach, she screamed that everything was my fault for exposing her instead of helping her solve her problems quietly. The irony wasn't lost on me that Ashley's downfall had been caused by the same meticulous planning and attention to detail she'd used to engineer my destruction. Marcus Rodriguez's investigation had been so thorough that her defense attorneys couldn't challenge the evidence or create reasonable doubt about her guilt. The comprehensive documentation I'd organized made prosecution straightforward and conviction inevitable. Ashley had been destroyed by her own weapons, turned against her with the same precision she'd used against me. As winter settled over our hometown, the consequences of Ashley's choices continued to ripple outward like cracks in ice. The family business faced bankruptcy, Dad's health declined under the stress of legal battles and guilt, and Ashley awaited sentencing that would likely send her to federal prison for the better part of a decade. The woman who'd orchestrated my exile to claim everything for herself had ended up losing more than she'd ever imagined possible, while the sister she'd tried to destroy was building a new life far from the wreckage she'd created. 2,000 miles away in Portland, Oregon, I was discovering what it felt like to live without constantly managing other people's crises or walking on eggshells around family dysfunction. The apartment I'd rented was small but entirely mine. No shared spaces, no family photos filled with painful memories, no constant reminders of sacrifices that had never been appreciated. For the first time since I was 12 years old, my schedule revolved around my own needs and goals rather than someone else's emergencies and manipulations. The job I'd found at a mid-sized architectural firm was everything Dad's construction company had never been: professional, ethical, and focused on merit rather than family politics. My supervisor, Janet Morrison, was a woman in her 50s who'd built her career on competence and integrity, qualities she recognized and valued in others regardless of their family circumstances. Within 6 months, I'd been promoted to project manager based on my ability to organize complex workflows and communicate with difficult clients, skills I'd developed through years of managing Ashley's chaos. Therapy had been Dr. Patricia Williams's first recommendation when I'd walked into her office carrying the weight of a lifetime's worth of suppressed anger and betrayal. She specialized in family trauma and narcissistic abuse, helping me understand that Ashley's behavior fit textbook patterns of manipulative personality disorders. The revelation that I'd been raised by and sacrificed for someone incapable of genuine empathy was both liberating and devastating. Liberating because it explained so much, devastating because it meant the love I'd felt was never reciprocated. The healing process was complicated by years of conditioning that had taught me to prioritize everyone else's needs over my own. Learning to say no without guilt, to pursue my own interests without apologizing, to expect reciprocity in relationships was like learning a foreign language at 36 years old. Dr. Williams helped me recognize that my pattern of excessive sacrifice hadn't been noble, it had been enabling behavior that allowed Ashley to avoid consequences while preventing me from developing healthy boundaries. New friendships formed slowly but authentically in ways I'd never experienced. My neighbor Lisa, a single mother working as a nurse, became the first person I'd ever met who appreciated my reliability without trying to exploit it. She offered to help when I was sick with flu, brought soup and insisted I rest instead of working through the illness. When I initially tried to refuse her kindness, she laughed and told me friendship was supposed to be mutual support, not one-sided sacrifice. The running group I joined at a local park introduced me to people who knew nothing about my family history and accepted me based on who I was rather than what I'd survived. Training for my first marathon became a metaphor for rebuilding my life, setting personal goals, pushing through physical and emotional barriers, celebrating achievements that belonged entirely to me. Crossing that finish line 9 months after leaving home was the first time I'd accomplished something without sharing credit or having the victory overshadowed by someone else's drama. Dating was the most challenging aspect of building a new identity. My relationship patterns had been shaped by years of giving without receiving, of accepting breadcrumbs of affection as adequate compensation for extraordinary devotion. When Michael, a teacher I'd met through the running group, showed genuine interest in my thoughts and feelings without expecting me to solve his problems or manage his emotions, I initially assumed he was being polite rather than sincere. Learning to recognize and accept genuine care required unlearning decades of accepting poor treatment as normal. The letters from Dad arrived monthly, each one more desperate than the last. He'd hired attorneys to track down my address, sent packages through multiple forwarding services, even contacted my new employer hoping they'd pass along messages. His communications progressed from formal apologies to emotional breakdowns on paper, detailing his recognition of Ashley's manipulation and his desperate desire to rebuild our relationship. Each letter remained unopened for days while I decided whether reading his words would help or harm my healing process. Ashley's attempts at contact were less frequent but more disturbing. She'd somehow obtained my phone number and called collect from county jail, alternating between threats and manipulation depending on her mood. Her voicemails ranged from promises that she had friends who could find me anywhere to tearful pleas for financial help with her legal defense. When I blocked her number, letters began arriving from inmates she'd convinced to write on her behalf, all following similar scripts about family loyalty and second chances. The news of Ashley's sentencing reached me through a Google alert I'd set up months earlier. 5 years in federal prison for the espionage charges, plus additional state time for theft and drug dealing that would likely keep her incarcerated for the better part of a decade. The article mentioned Dad's business filing for bankruptcy and his declining health under the stress of legal battles and family dissolution. Reading about the complete destruction of the life I'd left behind felt surreal. Like watching a movie about someone else's tragedy. Dr. Williams helped me process the complex emotions that Ashley's imprisonment triggered. Relief that she couldn't hurt anyone else for years. Guilt that part of me felt satisfied by her consequences. Sadness for the little girl I'd raised who'd grown into someone capable of such calculated cruelty. Anger at myself for still caring about someone who'd never truly cared about me. The realization that loving someone doesn't obligate you to accept abuse from them was simple in concept but revolutionary in application. The decision about whether to respond to Dad's letters came during a therapy session focused on forgiveness versus reconciliation. Dr. Williams explained that forgiveness was an internal process of releasing anger for my own peace of mind, while reconciliation required changed behavior and genuine accountability from the other person. Dad's letters showed recognition of his mistakes but also included justifications about Ashley's manipulation that suggested he still didn't fully understand his role in enabling the dysfunction. After a year of silence, I finally wrote back to Dad. My letter was short and carefully worded, acknowledging his pain while maintaining firm boundaries about contact. I explained that forgiveness was something I was working toward for my own healing, but reconciliation would require him to understand why I couldn't trust his judgment about family relationships. I wasn't ready for phone calls or visits, but I was willing to correspond occasionally if he could respect my need for space and time. His response arrived within days, filled with gratitude and promises to respect whatever boundaries I needed. He wrote about selling the house and business, moving to a smaller apartment, and attending therapy to understand how he'd failed both his daughters in different ways. He asked no questions about my new life, made no demands for information or contact, simply expressed hope that someday I might be willing to rebuild some form of relationship with him. 2 years into my Portland life, I realized I'd stopped checking over my shoulder for signs of family drama. My days were filled with work I enjoyed, friendships based on mutual respect, and personal goals that reflected my own values rather than other people's expectations. The hypervigilance that had characterized my childhood, constantly monitoring other people's moods and needs to prevent crises, had gradually faded into healthy awareness without anxiety. The question of whether I'd ever fully reconcile with Dad remained open, dependent on his continued growth and my ongoing healing. Some relationships could be rebuilt after betrayal, but others were too damaged to restore completely. The family I'd been born into was gone forever, destroyed by Ashley's choices and Dad's enabling, but the life I was building belonged entirely to me. For the first time in my adult life, that felt like enough. Ashley's latest letter, forwarded through multiple addresses and marked with a prison postmark, sat on my kitchen counter unopened. After 2 years of therapy and growth, I'd learned that some communications weren't worth reading, that protecting my peace of mind mattered more than maintaining connection with people who'd proven incapable of healthy relationships. The choice of whether to read her words was mine alone, free from guilt or obligation to maintain family ties that had never served my well-being. Standing at my apartment window watching Portland's morning rain, I reflected on the journey from devoted sister to independent woman. The girl who'd sacrificed her teenage years to raise Ashley was gone, replaced by someone who knew her own worth and refused to accept less than she deserved. The price of that transformation had been losing the only family I'd ever known, but the alternative, continuing to enable dysfunction while sacrificing my own life, had ultimately been unbearable. Have you ever had to choose between family loyalty and your own well-being? How would you handle discovering that someone you'd sacrificed everything for had been manipulating and betraying you all along? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear about your experiences with difficult family situations and how you found the strength to prioritize your own peace of mind. Don't forget to like this video if my story resonated with you, subscribe for more real-life family drama that'll keep you thinking long after the video ends, and share this with anyone who needs to hear that it's okay to walk away from toxic relationships, even family ones. Thank you for listening to my story and for reminding me through your support that choosing yourself isn't selfish, sometimes it's the only way to survive. Wishing you all the courage to set boundaries and the wisdom to know when love requires letting go.